Bangkorai Lore, Part 3. The Viridian Sentinel. Hush, my dear, go back to sleep. The trolls can't get you here, not so long as there is a Viridian Sentinel. What's that? You want to hear about the Sentinel again? Of course, my dear. Just lie back on your pillow and listen. Everyone in northern Bangkorai knows about the Viridian Sentinel. The Sentinel is the guardian who makes all the wild things stay in the woods. The trolls, the bears, the witches and their wolves. None may come into the vanquished lands from the wild, so long as the Sentinel keeps watch, and the Sentinel will always keep watch. Did you know there was a time when there was no Viridian Sentinel? It was long ago, but in the before times. We Bretons had just won our freedom from the Durrani elves, and the elves were still spiteful about it. Go ahead and take these lands you call High Rock, they said. We will not have them long. We will retreat to our towered island. We will renounce our covenant with the earth bones, and we will give these lands back to the wild. As is often the way when elves speak, we did not understand what they meant, so we merely shrugged and set about the hard work of making the land our own. We plowed the fields and sowed the crops. We fenced meadows and made pastures for our livestock. We built the roads and market towns so our people could sell each other the produce and wares, and all seemed well. But then bad things began to happen on the farms nearest the woods. Witches lurked under the eaves, and Bretons who got too close to the forest began to disappear into the shadows, never to be seen again. Soon the farmers had to abandon the fields that were next to the woods. It got worse. Things began to come out of the woods, fell creatures and beasts, mostly at night, but sometimes even in the day, and they roamed across the farmlands, menacing the farm families, slaying them where they could. Many farmers said, "We cannot stand before these creatures from the wild. Come, we shall leave our farms and go to the towns." But when they got to the towns, they found there was no work for the farmers, and even worse, there was little or nothing to eat, because the farmers were no longer sending food to the towns. The townspeople blamed the farmers for abandoning their farms, and the farmers blamed the townspeople for not sending armed watch to guard them. No one could agree on what to do. One of the farm boys, a lad named Greenwood, was very worried. He went into the chapel and prayed earnestly to Stendar, saying, "O righteous Lord of mercy and protection, we are in sore plight and in need of your aid, for the beasts of the wild are no longer contained, and our lands are reverting to wildness. Soon there will be no place for mortals who love order and harmony. I fear we will become beasts, forget our name, and turn back on the divines. Show us, O Lord, how this may be prevented." Then a kingfisher flew into the chapel and landed on the altar before Greenwood. It was a very large kingfisher, larger than any the lad had ever seen. It cocked its head, and then began to whistle and clack its beak, and Greenwood seemed to hear speech among the whistles and clacks, with words that said, "The beasts come out of the wild because they have forgotten your names, and believe you to be beasts like themselves, whom it is lawful to slay. Someone must go to the wild and tell the beast that he has a name, and that the vanquished lands are forfeit to his claim." Then the kingfisher made a small mess, as birds will, and flew away. The lad bowed and said, "I shall do this for my family and the other families of the vanquished lands." He hugged his father, he kissed his mother, and he left the town and went back to the edge of the wild. There he met a savage tiger who made as if to pounce upon him, but the lad said, "It is not lawful to pounce upon me, for I have a name, and I am no beast. My name is Greenwood, and I claim this land as vanquished. Return to the wild, and come here no more." And do you know what? The savage tiger did exactly that, and so the ravening wolves, and the shambling bears, and the fierce trolls, and the wicked spriggans all returned to the wild, and came to the vanquished vanquished lands no more. When this was done, the lad hoped his work was over and he could return to his family. But it was not so, for always new beasts came from the wild who had to be taught the boundaries. So the lad lived thereafter under the eaves of the woods and walked to the edge of the wild, telling the beasts his name and turning them back. And our people called him the Viridian Sentinel. Eventually the Sentinel grew very old and felt that soon he might walk the boundaries no more. He began to worry, but a girl came to him and said she had been spoken to by a bird, and thereafter the two walked the border together. And when the Sentinel finally passed on and his name went with his soul to Aetherius, the girl became the new Viridian Sentinel, and the vanquished lands were still safe. So it has been ever after, and so it will always be. The True Told Tale of Helen, Part 1. From the History of Histories, as told to the young Prince Vaharajad. Know then, O Prince, that after the Regatta swept across Hammerfell, driving all the tusk folk before it, a time of peace befell, whereupon the people who were once Yokudans were able to lay down the sword and take up the shovel and trowel. And for 3 spans of a person's life all the Redguards did delve and build, and many were the great works that were erected above the sands. And a few did study the way of the sword, for all were constructing monuments to the greatness of our people. Now east of the Alakir and south of the pass of Bangkorai, the ever-laudable Queen Ojibwa did cause to have a city built of splendor, all white stone and fluted columns, and the city was named Ojwambu, after its thrice eminent monarch. And its streets and broad avenues were replete with the houses and halls devoted to the arts, both mercantile and inspirational. The people strolled the streets bedecked in fine garments, and bedizened with bright jewels, and partaking of delicate vitins, and hearkening to the tunes both rousing and restful, and all was pleasing thereby. In an unconsidered corner in the shadows of the walls stood the city's hall of virtues of war, and there did the worthy Helen, being the last of the Ansai, teach such of Ojwambu's youth as were yet so inclined to the way of the sword. Now these youths were few, and though they suffered raillery and unkind bandage from their peers, they found the aging Helen an inspiration nonetheless, and learned the way of the sword until they became true Redguard warriors. And this was as well, as you will see. For in the mountain range called Dragon's Tail the tusk folk still lurked, beating their breasts and rending their ragged garments in rage and grievance against the Redguards. And among them was a great goblin warlord who had escaped the curse of Divad through chinery, and thus had not been diminished. This giant goblin was possessed of both slyness and sinew, and long he had worked among the tribes of Dragon's Tail until one day he awoke to find himself warlord of all the tusk folk therein, and his name was Magazor Rockhand. So Magazor raised his great blade Bone Hewer, and roared in a mighty voice like an earthquake, and declared that day, the day of vengeance, was at last at hand. Then Magazor led his endwise army down from Dragon's Tail, and it swept into Hammerfell like a great storm, and none could stand before it. The people of the fallen waste fled before the fury of the tusk folk, and many of those were caught, and they sought refuge behind the walls of Ojamumbu, until the city was overfilled thereby. The citizens cried out in distress and apprehension, saying, "Who will fight for us, O Queen? For we have become artisans and pleasance rights, and have forgotten the way of the sword." And the Queen spake, saying, "Are there none among us who remember the way of the sword?" Then venerable Helen stepped forward and bowed before his monarch, saying, "I remember the way of the sword, O my queen, or at least as much as I may, while I am the last Unsai. What I can do, I shall." Helen's students then stepped forward as well, and laid their swords at the feet of their queen. But the thrice eminent queen was dismayed by their fewness, and spake distraught, saying, "How shall we repel the endwise army with so few blades? For the tusk folk are as numerous as the sands and the dunes." But Helen was nowise deterred, and said boldly, "Take heart, O illustrious majesty, for your people are red guards, which means they come easily to the way. And once they have in their hands again the hilts of the blades, and they learn to quote once more from the Book of Circles, they will be a match for any folk in the round world, be they ever so numerous." "Be that as it may, venerable Ansai," replied the queen, "but even redguards need time to learn the way of the sword, and of time we have but little." "Then you must have more. Finding you a store of time shall be my task, the culmination of the work of my life, and I swear upon Ansai's right blade you shall have it." And he drew his blade, yea, even in the presence of the queen, and swore an oath upon the brotherhood and sisterhood of the blade. And behold, Helen seemed to grow to the stature of a giant, and a light shone from his blade's sharp edge, and all were obliged to avert their gaze. Yet when they were able to look once more, they saw naught but the venerable Helen smiling and sheathing his blade. And the last Ansai raised his hand as if to embrace the people of the city, and said, "Fellow Redguards, to you I bequeath the knowledge of the Book of Circles, which we have guarded long and well, that you may be equal to all threats whatsoever. These my students shall teach you their learning, and in good time you will all know once more the way of the sword." He turned then to the queen and said, "Now lead your people, O mighty monarch, for that is what you do best. Take them to the west, and spread the word of the way of the sword, that Hammerfell might make itself ready for the endwise army. I shall abide here in your city, which I and the other Ansai shall defend so long as we may, until our people are ready to fight for themselves." The True Told Tale of Helen, Part 2. So the queen took the venerable Helen at his word, and forthwith ordered her people to march west towards Alakir, while daily drilling from the Book of Circles. But the queen did move, as she was a wise queen, as she was an owl friend, and decreed all owls ought to be honoured and none slain, and in return the owls did many a favour for her. And so the queen did call the father of owls, and asked him to bide in the city and observe Helen's defence. "For I would learn," she said, "how one man shall defend a city entire." Even at the last the people of the city departed from her gates to take the secret ways to Alakir. The scouts of the Tuskfolk appeared in the east, and where they were noted by Helen, for though he was old, his eyes were keen. Then Helen spake, though there was none to hear but the father of owls, saying, "As the snake sheds its skin, so shall the Ansai rise anew from the husks of the past." He raised his sword and cried, "Sisters, brothers, I summon you to the succor of your people, for time folds upon itself, and then time is now." And he gestured with his blade to the left, and all along the battlements to the north there was a rustling as of snake skins, and lo, there arose among the parapets the shadows of a legion, and there stood the semblances of all the female Ansai who ever were, and they turned to Helen and saluted. So Helen gestured likewise to the right, and all along the battlements to the south there was a rustling, and lo, there arose the semblances of all the male Ansai who ever were, and they likewise saluted Helen. And then all north and south drew their bright blades and stood on the battlements awaiting. The scouts of the Tuskfolk stopped forthwith to observe the defences of the city. Surprised they were to see the battlements lined with goodly warriors, for they had been told that the folk of the city forgot the way of the sword. So they did consult among themselves as to who would carry this news to Warlord Maxor, and the quarrel and the quibble, for they feared the bearer of such news would have his head struck off. But finally the smallest with many blows was made to carry the report back to the warlord. So the scout reported to the warlord, that unaccountably the walls of the city were lined with many goodly defenders. Of an instant the rock hand struck off the scout's head, but then he took thought, for he was possessed of both slyness and sinew, and his thoughts were, what matter? We are as numberless as the sand in the dunes. We shall surround this city, leaving neither entry nor egress. We shall despoil their fields of their provender, and stop up the streams of their flow until no one within shall have to eat or drink, and thus the city shall fall. So the warlord ordered, and so it came to pass. The tusk folk took their leisure among the spoils of the outworks, casting jeers and taunts at the defenders on the walls, but the defenders replied naught. So the warlords and his army waited, amusing themselves most abominably at the expense of their prisoners, secure that in time the defenders of the city must wither and dwindle. But it was not so. Even long after, when the warlords' bone counters calculated that there must be no more to eat or drink within the city, the defenders stood still stalwart, saying naught. So the warlord summoned his shamans, saying, "Shamans, have we been befooled by the perfidious red guards? Are these goodly warriors we see lying the walls a battlement? Are they shadows?" So the shamans cast the portents and sacrificed twin infants, and sent Scullion to the east gate, whom Helen did spear from above. And they returned and said, "Nay, mighty warlord, we are not befooled, for these are goodly warriors we see lining the battlements. But how they may stand when they have not to eat nor drink, this we cannot tell." Of an instant, the warlord struck off the shamans' heads, and raised a bloody bone hewer and cried, "To arms, form ranks, for tonight we drink the blood of the defenders of the city." Of that battle, no living red guard survived to tell the tale, but nonetheless the wise queen did hear of it, in full, for the father of the owls did bear the tale to her ear. He told of how Helen and his Unsai withstood the assault, yea, for 17 days. But though there were goodly warriors, over time the Unsai did dwindle, though each left behind only a husk, like unto a snakeskin. Finally, only Helen stood at the east gate, which was burst open by the warlord with bone hewer held high, and Helen did seem to grow to match him in size, and the two met sword to sword. Long and long their blades clashed, until finally, as the moons rose, the rockhand smote Helen such a blow that he was struck to the ground. But even as he fell, Helen, who knew the cuts and thrusts of the Book of Circles, yea, each and every one, swung his sword and struck off the head of the warlord. Then both were dead, but in death only one was smiling and serene. The queen nodded to hear the news and said, "It is well." And she turned to her mighty army of Red Guard warriors, each of which knew the cuts and thrusts of the Book of Circles, yea, each and every one, and said, "Red Guards, march we now to retake our lands from the Tusk folk, and when we have regained our splendid city once more, we shall rename it Helen's Stand. And so shall it be, and so it has been, ever after." I hope you've been enjoying these lore readings, and if you have, please do consider subscribing to the channel. Also, come follow me over on twitch.tv/ICYIC, where I stream the Elder Scrolls Online 4 days a week. I'd love to see you there. Thanks for watching.